Welcome back to the Mercy Cast. I am your host, Raleigh Sadler. As always, we are learning the art of compassion through the adversity of life. Today, I want to talk about a season in our lives that we really don't like to talk about. It's that midlife season, that season where we don't really have a playbook necessarily, and things get a little weird, things get a little hard. You go to the doctor way more than you used to in your 20s. You're dealing with issues with your parents because they're getting older and you're needing to care for them more. Your relationship with your children is changing now. And it just comes to a head and it can be difficult. 19 years ago, Mikala began practicing medicine to heal sick and brokenhearted people. But at the same time, she realized she was brokenhearted. Her husband was an active addict and she had young children at home. And she worked something like 80 hours a week, finishing her residency at the hospital. She felt like she was drowning. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Mikala Albertson. She is the author of the new book, Everything I Wish I Could Tell You About Midlife, A Woman's Guide to Health in the Body You Actually Have. Dr. Albertson, welcome to the Mercy Cast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you're going through this midlife, I don't want to say crisis, that might be an overused term, but this midlife difficulty, and you are hurting, and you're probably hurting in public. Mikala, what were you learning as you were hurting alongside of others?
Well, yeah, I was fresh out of medical school and just practicing residency, and I was pretty newly married and a new mom, and I really thought that it was my job to figure out how to do life right. And that was going to be my plan. Like, I'm going to set everything up to do life perfectly. And it wasn't working very well. My husband had already been to rehab once, was actively using drugs and alcohol. He too was in residency, and there is a lot of pressure there. That's actually a pretty common problem for medical providers that we don't talk about very much. And I remember just, I'd have to be at the hospital often at 4:45 sometimes, and doing overnight call shifts and taking care of people. And it was the first time, I think, that I really got this like up close and personal time with people where we'd all stripped away some of our shiny exterior layers. And I remember just thinking like, oh, life is just hard, actually. And we're all just hurting. I've realized that time and time and time again in clinic with patients, or now as a writer, if you spend a little bit of time with anyone and get to strip away a few layers, there's a hard story there. And it doesn't mean we aren't doing life right. It doesn't mean that we're failing. It means that we're humans, that we're human beings. And so I think that's really when my love of the idea of healing and my passion for helping people through healing, which is actually lifelong because new things come along all the time, really kind of took hold.
So was that experience freeing for you?
At the time, it didn't feel freeing. It felt horrible. To say like, oh yeah, for years and years, it felt like, oh, I've really failed at this, or I don't know if I'm ever going to get out of this pit. And it's only now, I think, with the passage of time, and I'm so lucky to say that I'm still with my husband and he's 15 years clean and sober, that I can look back on that experience and realize how it changed me and how I am grateful to have had some of those times and some of those experiences, also being very brokenhearted. I think it takes us some time sometimes to realize what we've learned.
Absolutely. You mentioned this idea of failure, and especially 19 years ago, you're going through this, you're feeling like a failure, you've got a lot of things on your plate. And then as you realize that life is just hard, and then you're seeing other people suffering, and there's something beautiful about that when we realize that vulnerability is not something that makes us bad or weak, it makes us human. And yeah, you're kind of suffering alongside of other people. In that, how did your view of failure change?
Well, it took me a while, but I think I just realized like maybe it's not even a thing. Like being a human, do you fail at being human? I don't think so. I think you're just having more and more and more human experiences. And I didn't know that growing up. I didn't know that well into my 20s, that there maybe isn't necessarily a right or wrong way, that you
Right.
just kind of come through and you end up learning things, and that all that perfection stuff is pretend. I write a lot about that in my first book, that perfect is pretend. And there's so much beauty to be found in like the rubble of life, in those things that we think are failures. There's so much beauty there.
Well, as a recovering perfectionist, this idea of perfect is pretend is wonderful. I like hearing this. I want to know more about this. Tell me more about what you mean.
Yeah, I grew up thinking like, if I could just get the right career, if I could just have all the right things, if I could have the nice house and the perfect looking family.
Yeah.
And I realize now, I think I was always trying to outrun something. I couldn't have told you at the time that I was. I just thought that's what everybody was doing, was trying to have like the best, most perfect life possible. And now I can say, oh, you were outrunning like some painful things, and you were outrunning some things you were afraid of, and, some hard things already, and just trying to like cover them up with some spackling and like fill in all the holes, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. And now I think, gosh, this is freeing. I think it's freeing to just say, nah, like that's not how life is. And I'm probably one of the most annoying people in the world to talk to, because I just delve right into like hard conversations. So I know my girlfriends are like, do I have an hour to talk to Mikala? Can I call her? Do I have an hour? Because I just value vulnerability and authenticity so much now.
And it sounds like it's driven you to this place of radical acceptance, this place where you're willing to face things that you used to run from. Because you're right, with perfectionism, we're trying to prove that we're lovable, and so we can't make mistakes. But what happens is a lot of self loathing. Also, we can be harder on the people in our lives. You hold them to a higher standard than we really should, because
Yeah.
what they do now reflects upon us. And it's a really difficult way to live. But when you stop and you face that, then you realize it doesn't have to be what you've made it to be. Like, how did you get to that point where you could face things and not run?
Yeah, I'm just going to say that the recovery movement was really important for me, and kind of taking my own path while my husband took his. I really thought when we got married that everything was supposed to be together, like we really were one person. So I had to kind of chip through that idea, and we both kind of had to do our own separate healing. So Al-Anon was really important for me.
Yeah.
Al-Anon is the support group for kids and parents and family and friends of people who maybe have an addict in their life. And I think one of their core things that you learn that you just hate so much at the beginning is acceptance. That idea that there are a lot of things in life that I cannot change. And unfortunately, after you realize that, you can't unrealize it. And on the other side of that, it's really, really free.
Well, there's something beautiful to being able to say, I can't manage my life right now. This is too big for me. And you start to think about it as a perfectionist, you think everything's your fault, or you just get mired in failure and you just allow shame to take over. When you actually say it's unmanageable, you're able to take a step back and say, okay, I inherited some of this, and some of this was put on me, and other people put their stuff on me. And so maybe I'm not what my thoughts are saying I am.
Yeah, other people put their stuff on you, or you took it without asking. You just grabbed onto it yourself. I mean, that's sort of how I did the first few years of marriage, was I really took on a lot of things to solve that no one asked me to try to solve. And so the idea of acceptance, radical acceptance, I think, is being like, when things happen, that you can just go, wow, gosh, that's going to be hard, and not necessarily pick it up and make it yours.
Yeah, to be able to say, man, that's really terrible. I hate that you're going through this, and I can be your friend.
Yeah.
It might help to talk to someone else for deeper things, but I will be glad to be your friend, because I loved what you said of saying my husband and I had to take different paths to healing. because we do talk about the two become one flesh. We do talk about the marital union as it being one cohesive unit, which, yes, okay. But that doesn't mean that the two are one. You're both still there.
Yeah.
You're not, you're not some Frankenstein married monster. You are two people who are together, and you've brought stuff that you got to work on, and you have to decide you need to change, and vice versa. And
Yeah.
that's got to be
And
hard.
I had that realization when he was on his second trip to rehab and we then had 2 young children. I had the realization like, oh, I think I might be a single parent actually. And I don't know if we're actually going to be married. And I had to kind of come through like, what do I need to do to be okay and be alone in this with our family? And that was like a really hard realization. And I also thought, I think he's either going to get better or he's going to die, which is a really hard realization to come to.
And I bet as you've already processed the fact that you can't manage life and you're facing that and you come to this hard realization, I bet that was tough of saying, yeah, he's either going to figure this out or he may die. But it also sounds like you were putting the emphasis where it needed to be. You weren't trying to necessarily save him from himself, which is very difficult. Oftentimes when we try to save our friends or family, we put our place in the role of the savior, and it's like trying to save someone who's drowning. At the end of the day, the statistics are pretty clear that if someone is violently drowning, they may pull you down with them. And so being able to go to the right sources and go to the right people and seek outside help, I think is helpful. And it sounds like you both did that. Like you went to
We did.
Al-Anon, and
I think
he was in
and I suddenly had 2 little children. And so suddenly it wasn't just me anymore. And, I certainly wasn't going to let him take my kids down. I think that really changed the perspective as well as a mom. Yeah.
And so you have faced things that so many of us have faced, and you've lived to tell about it. Your family is still together. You're living a healthy life and you're facing life. And I love that. And so that's why I love the fact that you wrote this book, because this book it's a map in a sense. It's a guidebook for people who are dealing with things that feel like it's only them, but you're basically illuminating the fact that no, this is all of us. And I'm going to be your guide and I'm going to walk you through. And so tell me why you wrote this book.
Yeah. So this new book is called Everything I Wish I Could Tell You About Midlife. And it's a women's guide to health in the body you actually have. At the end of that residency training, I did a fellowship in women's health. And so I've just kind of always had a heart for women and their stories and helping them through their life experiences. And now I'm this 45-year-old midlife woman myself. And I just felt the need to sort of write down this guide. I noticed in the last 18 years in clinic, I'm hearing a lot of the same stories from women in midlife and a lot of the same symptoms coming in. I'm tired. I don't feel like myself. I don't have the energy anymore. Like, what's going on? I don't remember things. And now we kind of have this trending term that we're hearing a lot about, perimenopause. So I think we're better at talking about some of these things, but I wanted to put some reliable information down for women. And there's a lot of story in this book because I think we learn best through hearing stories. So patient stories, personal stories, and then I sort of jump into the medicine and some of the science behind why we're feeling this way and some of the options for things we can do.
And so what are some of the things you're hearing back from people that have read the book and have seen the book who are comparing the book to their experience?
Well, I'm hearing lots of good feedback. I think social media has been wonderful for connecting people. It's also like this place that can really wildly spread misinformation, disinformation, and it's a great spot for marketing to hop in and tell us things. And especially in this perimenopause space and this midlife space, I think marketers saw like a big gap where we weren't talking about that stuff. And so they've done a really great job hopping in and selling us things. And the feedback I've got is I was as confused as ever, I think, on what I should do. Should I be taking hormones? Should I not? Should I be taking these supplements? Should I not? And having a book that you can come back to with current medical guidelines and real stories and reliable information has been, I think, a good service for women. I'm so proud of being able to offer this to them. I wish that I could have been handing it out over the last, 18 years in clinic, like, take this with you, because 15 or 20-minute office visits aren't enough time to get into everything that we really need to talk about.
Well, yeah, there is this gulf of information, and then, it's not going to stay a gulf for long. It's going to be filled up, and all these people on social media are coming up with these really popular solutions and explanations and diagnoses. And I mean, every now and then I'll take a quiz because I'm just bored. I might be having like 10 moments of free time. I see a quiz pop up. I'm like, I'm going to take it. And it says, you have cholera. And I'm like, huh? It's like, and
yes.
And I'm one of those people, I cannot do WebMD. I don't allow myself to, because every time I do, I look at it and I'm like, this doesn't look good. This doesn't look good. And then, I'll schedule an appointment with a doctor, and they're like, yeah, don't do it. Don't let me.
Yeah.
I went to school. Like, let me tell you what I think. If you need a second opinion, get a second opinion. But there's a lot of stuff out there. And I think what you and your book are doing is you're acknowledging that people have questions, people are scared, and people are facing their own brokenness and their own mortality and their own vulnerability. And they're going to go to the closest solution that's out there. And that's why I love that you wrote your book, because you're saying, no, here's something that, like, I love just looking at the back. Guidance, reassurance, science, stories, practical tools, and support. You have all of these things in your book, whereas a lot of the stuff we find may not necessarily be based on the newest science, or it may not be coming from the most trustworthy source.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the telltale signs, I think, is like what they're promising you. If at the end there's some kind of, here, we know you have this pain point, we know you have this problem, we're going to solve it for you. Here is the answer. So I have a whole chapter in there kind of about what we were talking about before on control and acceptance and agency over our own bodies, but that it's limited agency. There are only so many things about our health that we do have control over. And when we're promised that magic wand or that thing that's going to like make you suddenly thin and fit and successful and all these things, like, that's a big red flag. And so that's one of the things I try to tell readers and women that I come across, like, where are they going with that? Is there something at the end that you need to sign up for to buy? Is there some kind of program or something? A lot of times there may be a reason to give pause there.
Well, and when people offer that promise and they're appealing to whatever pain point we have, whatever weakness we have, do you think that can be sometimes exploitative?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I think that's how marketing works. And we've got to find a pain point. And then how is our product? How can we promote this product as the solution to that pain point? So I know marketing is a necessary thing. And I'm promoting a book. So for goodness sakes, that's marketing as well. But I do just like to, that's why I think the chapter on control is maybe 3 chapters in or something. Like, let's just remember, let's talk about what are our expectations. My 50-year-old body is going to be different than my 20-year-old body. And I can take all the supplements in the world and they're not going to be the fountain of youth. We are all aging. And what is our real goal here? For me, and for what I try to talk about, it's, I just want to be as healthy as I can be in this body that I'm actually living in. And I just want to feel good and be active, and like, let's kind of adjust what our expectations are for the long run.
A few years ago, I realized that I was like 30 to 40 pounds overweight. I was having a lot of health issues. And there were a lot of other things that were just I was struggling with in life. Like, it was tough. And I remember I just started walking, kind of like Forrest Gump. He's like, I just started running. I just started
Yeah.
walking, and I was walking 10 miles a day. And then, I
Mm.
started getting healthier. I started eating healthier. I started using my time differently. I started giving myself the space I needed and actively caring for myself and loving myself by offering myself the things that ultimately I needed. And now I can say at 46, I'm probably in the best shape I've been in a long time, but it's because I set time aside for daily walks and for me, a walk is not just physical. There's emotional
Yeah.
stuff. It slows me down. And I think for me, when I started doing it, it helped. And even this podcast was developed as I was kind of in that season of healing and this idea of learning the art of compassion through the adversity that we face. It carries this connotation that as you are getting through something and as you have faced that scary thing and you wind up on the other side, now you're a guide. And
Yeah.
what does it feel like to be a guide now? Because you've faced the scary things about family, about yourself, things that you can't control. And now you're at a point where you're like, I'm still going through stuff, but now I want to bring
Yeah.
others alongside of me.
Well, I love how you described that. And I think you described it through a story, but what happened was like you had like a mindset shift. Like you didn't set out to lose 30 or 40 pounds. And how am I going to do that? I got to change the way I eat. I got to be exercising every day and I got to be doing this and I got to be that. You just started walking. And so I kind of like to help women just kind of flip that, make that little switch to what would it mean to feel well? And what
Mm.
does that mean? Instead of like the beauty and wellness industry, which is really, I think, mostly selling us how to be thin. What if we focused on being well and what feels good for our bodies? And so I offer it like this offering of peace for women to just say, oh, yeah, I want some of that. And it doesn't have to be hard or punishing. I don't have to be afraid of it. It's not a fear based thing. It's like there's this peace available to you and doing these things, all of those things that we know you mentioned. You're walking a lot, it sounds like. So great exercise, changing the way you feed yourself, turning some of the compassion maybe you've had toward others to yourself,
Yeah.
actually caring for your body because it matters and it feels good. Gosh, that is wellness. That's what it means to be well. And so I just love inviting others into that little mindset shift. And I think that's how we'll live our healthiest lives, actually, even through chronic illness, or even through adversity, or even through hard times.
And I had forgotten that a friend who's kind of a coach of mine, he said, what does it feel like, or what would it feel like to feel well
Mm-hmm.
or to be happy? He helped me see down the road of, okay, the goal is to get here. And so once I had that, now I had kind of a rack to hang everything else on. And so I was able to be like, okay, so to get there, I'm going to walk. And then,
Yeah.
as I'm walking, I'm like, and walking has always been a theme in my life. I'm always happiest when I'm moving. And sometimes
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it annoys people if they're on the phone with me and they're like, well, you're walking. Why aren't you just sitting in your office? I think more clearly when I'm walking, and
Yeah.
I like to get the body moving, and I know not everyone is the same, and that's okay. But I think finding for yourself, what are the steps to get to that goal that you have, that thing that you want, which you've used a lot of counterfeit things to get there before in the past. Maybe you've overeaten. Maybe you do these Netflix binges under the name of self-care when at the end of the day, they're not recharging you. If anything, they're exhausting you. You know,
Yeah.
what healthy practices, and they don't have to be big practices, but what are some healthy things that we can do that will help us just get the ball a little bit farther down the field towards that goal?
I love that. The other one that you mentioned that's been a big one for me, and I know is a big one for many, many, many women, is learning how to eat. I think we are just inundated with like what to eat, what we should be eating, what we shouldn't be eating, what's good and bad, and, good diets, good foods, bad foods. And so that's kind of been the other one that has just been peace offering for my own body is like, what sounds good to you? What would you like to eat? What makes you feel good? And kind of not restricting those things. I am just finally learning that as a 45-year-old woman. So along with movement, because movement feels good, not because I'm punishing or trying to, burn off calories or earn my next meal. Along with movement, it's like, well, what do I want to eat? And what is good? And what do I like? And not feeling shameful about things that I eat. So there's a whole chapter in this new book on body image and disordered eating and how we can feed ourselves better. So that's a huge one for women, I think.
I have a friend he'd been a personal trainer for years, and then he had studied fitness and he had studied about eating habits. And I was just talking to him and I was like, man, I think sometimes, and this was during that season where I just wasn't healthy. And I was like, I think sometimes I don't know if my eating habits are good, and how would you advise? And he asked me a question and it shook me. I'm shocked that it shook me because it wasn't some incredibly invasive question, but he just said, what's your relationship with food? And for some weird reason, it bothered me a lot. I didn't want to answer the question. And I'm like, what in the world? Like, why? This is nothing. This is like the most basic question I've ever been asked in my life. But what it got to was, I think even when I heard him ask it, I was realizing I'm having food and my eating habits do something for me that something else should be doing. I'm going to food for comfort.
Yeah.
Rather than eating to thrive, I'm eating to survive, but also to self-soothe. And that realization, it was weird. Because I'd never seen myself as someone who had disordered eating or anything like that. But then realizing that in that moment, I'm like, okay, I want to look at the way I eat. And I have been able to do that. But it was just, sometimes a lot of us will talk about maybe eating our feelings or, things like that. And all I know was when he asked that question, it did evoke a response in me. I didn't like it. And I think that's a good question for a lot of us who we've reached midlife and now we have a bunch of patterns. We have things that may have served us in our 20s and been great, but they're not serving us anymore. And so how would you suggest that we ask ourselves those questions? Like, what is our relationship with food? Or ask ourselves questions that can expose those patterns that aren't serving us anymore.
Yeah, I love that. I do think, or there's patterns that I fell into that I didn't even know was really until you bring it to the surface and look at it, you're like, oh yeah, I do always do that. I do also like to just offer to people a bit about seasons of healing. And there are times, I think, when you are in you're in like a really tough season. You're in the middle of it. You are in the pit.
Yeah.
And so there may be times when that question isn't necessary yet because it may feel like just something else that you need to do or something else that you're not doing right or that you've had wrong or that So I just want to throw that out there to say you have to kind of evaluate where you are and what your bandwidth is currently. And perhaps you can say, yes, right now I sort of have unhealthy eating habits and I'm using food in a way that it's for comfort and that I need that right now. And that's okay. Because that won't last forever. You won't be in the pit forever. And you can say, there will be another time and a space for me to deal with that, but that is not today. I would do that sometimes with patients in clinic, even around smoking. Like I want everybody to quit smoking, but there would be times when we would decide together that today was not the day. And we would talk about it later. So I just want to offer that. But yes, if you're in this place where you are sort of on this wellness journey and what do you want? I think that's a beautiful way to start. What would it mean to be well, to feel well? And what would it mean to really feed myself well? And I think when you're doing that, some of those old crutches or some of those old things that you're using, suddenly you realize like, that's not actually well. Like it maybe feels good for the moment, but then I don't feel good. So I think that's a great way to phrase it because it kind of just is the raw question, right? And you sort of have to look at the answers.
Well, you touched on two things that I want to explore. One, you touched on that idea of accepting it. Like you're never going to change something unless you accept that it's reality. And so you
Yeah.
accept something, but there is a freedom in saying, okay, I accept that this is happening. And I know that right now is not the time, but I know that it's there. I see it. I see that it's in the car with me. I'm not going to ignore it. That
Yeah.
is a huge step towards healing. But then you also touched on this idea that, especially with the gulf that has been filled with all of these social media snake oil salesmen who are offering healing to us and they're defining and diagnosing everything for us. And it's very easy to fall into that trap. But you basically touched on this idea that sometimes we can feel the pressure if something's going wrong to do something, to change something, to do it immediately. And I'm a person of faith, and I look at life through the lens of law and gospel. And within Christianity, it's, the law that says, do this and you will live. It's summarized by like the Mosaic law, the 10 Commandments. And then the gospel says, it is finished. This has been done for you. You are free. And the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus in our place. But what a lot of people don't see in life is, yes, there's that big capital L law, like the 10 Commandments, but there's also the lowercase laws of if you lose 10 pounds, then you're going to be acceptable. If you're funny enough and friendly enough, people will like you. If you just smile more, which a lot of my friends who are women have grown up with people saying, why don't you just smile more? Which is really, it comes across as pretty insulting. At least that's what they tell me,
Yes.
People aren't necessarily telling me that all the time. They're not saying, Raleigh, your problem is that you don't smile enough. Every now and then someone will be like, you have a great smile. You should smile. But that's saying it differently.
Yeah.
And it's just like we have these little L laws that are there for us to prove our enoughness. And I love how you're saying, just if you got something, you see something, you notice a pattern, notice it. And you don't have to fix it because you're kind of guiding us away from, we've got to do this to live. We've got to do this to be happy because that's what we're seeing on social media. That's what we're seeing on TV. That's what we're seeing everywhere we look. And we need someone to say that we're okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you and I both have said now we are maybe recovering perfectionists. And I will say that so often I would get maybe what I was chasing for a minute. And then isn't it surprising that it wouldn't give you the feeling or the results or the happiness or the fulfillment that you thought it would?
Yeah.
That it's always like a temporary thing. And then some other carrot is dangled in front of you. And so you're just on the chase again. And so I think what happens when it's always like, well, you got to be doing this, you got to be doing that. Don't miss this. This is what you need to be happy. My entire first book is about being ordinary and how life is just pretty ordinary most of the time. And we are ordinary people doing ordinary things and how much beauty is there. And that when we're always chasing perfection or something better or something different, we're like missing our lives. We're missing the little ordinary moments that are happening right now today. So I want to encourage women not to miss what's happening now in their bodies or their relationships or in midlife, as hard as it is, but to just be present in it and we don't have to continue striving.
A while back, I went on a pilgrimage of sorts called the Camino de Santiago. And I was doing this path and I had just worked through my fear of the walk because it was heavy. Like it was a really hard walk. I'm a flatlander and I'm walking through mountains. It was tough. And by the third day, I'd been walking all day and I had just conquered I had hit my glass ceiling and busted through it. And I was just happy about that. But then as I'm talking to people and I reconnected with all these people that I'd been walking with, they were like, we are about to hike this mountain range. And I didn't book the accommodations that would have allowed me to do that mountain range. And I would have had to rebook everything. And it just felt like a lot of work. And I remember talking to a guy and he goes, I feel like if you don't do this, you're missing the whole point. Anyone who asks you about this Camino, they're going to say, did you do that? And you're going to say no, and you're going to miss a life experience. I mean, he was laying it on hard. And I remember going to sleep that night, wrestling with the expectations of others. And do I have to do this? And am I not going to have a real experience if I don't do this? Then the next day, one of my friends who I'd met said, are you going to walk? Are you going to do it? And I looked at him and I said, no, Luis, I'm not doing it at all. And he looks at me right in the eyes. He kind of points his finger at me and he goes, good. He's like, good. You must walk your own Camino. And the Camino is it's a parable of life at the end of the day. You know, it's a little life. And I think for me and for all of us, as we approach midlife, we have to realize that there are so many people out there and there's so many things out there saying what the ideal life is. And I think the most beautiful thing is your life. No one else has one like it. And you can be present in that with all the goods and the bads that come with it, because everyone else has goods and bads. They're all just different. And so how do we grasp that? Or how do we get closer to just being okay with, this sounds cheesy, but being okay with not being okay and being present in that?
Yeah. I think that's something I'm just going to wrestle with forever.
Yeah.
You know, I wrote a whole book it's called Ordinary on Purpose, was my first book. And I love that. And then I get caught up in it again. And this, the next thing comes along and then I strive for that for a while until I finally, I come back down. So I think it's kind of that is the lifelong question, I think. And that is certainly part of my healing journey and coming back to that. But I really try to notice the ordinary things that are happening. I think that's where art comes in. I think that's where I write a lot. I love to write about just otherwise ordinary, boring stories just for myself to have. I think a lot happens by noticing. So that's where I try to do it. But my goodness, throw me something to strive for and I'm going to be off and chasing it. So I wish I had the answer to that question. Yeah, you're living the imperfect life over there, right? So yeah, what's your answer?
Well, I think at the end of the day, like our lives, whether good or bad, once we accept them, because I didn't even know what acceptance really was. I'd heard the word, but I didn't know that it was just this saying of, okay, a thing is a thing. This is reality. And not running from it, not being in denial about it, not making excuses, but saying, yeah, sometimes I do this. And this is probably why I do this, if I know why. Yeah. Sometimes I don't even know why. I'll just say, okay, this is a thing I'm doing. I'm going to be aware of it. I'm going to recognize that it's in the car with me. Okay. Like, I don't have to let it drive. It's like,
yeah.
And so I think, I think being present with that has helped me, but I feel like my experience has taught me a lot. And so like for you, both of your books come from your experience. And so I want to ask a question two ways. Like, how has your experience shed light on your work, and how has your work shed light on your experience?
Oh, I love that. Yeah. I do think that first book I think they just kind of follow each other. I needed to write the first book. It comes out much more memoir. It is like the story of my life and all these little things that I'd been carrying along that I never really talked about. And so maybe it sounds really selfish to say that first book was kind of for me.
Yeah,
and yeah. And then suddenly it was just out there. And I don't know, it's like I took off a coat, I guess. And then this second book is, who am I actually and what do I have to offer the world? And I am these two things. I am someone who likes to be vulnerable and I love to tell stories and I have some good hard stories to tell. And I have this background in this medical expertise. And so, how do I put those two things together into a book for someone? And so, the second book is sort of the answer to that question, like, what has my experience given me, or what sort of light has it shed? And so that's what this second book is, an offering for others about what I've learned.
That is so good. And I want you to share a little bit of what you learned in these last moments, but I'm going to ask you a question that, this is underhand, slow pitch softball, but how would you encourage those of us in middle life who are just trying to figure it out? How would you encourage us today?
Yeah, I think I want to take some of the pressure off and say, there isn't anything wrong with you. You're not a failure. You are like this beautiful, flawed, wonderful human. And I end this second book, Everything I Wish I Could Tell You About Midlife, with a chapter about a woman who I'd seen for years who was dying, and how at the very end, she taught me so much about love. And so if I could encourage you today, it's that you are so loved. You are beloved, which I think is a beautiful word. Despite maybe what you've gotten wrong before, or what your flaws are, or what you're floundering through right now, you are beloved. And that isn't something that will ever change. So if I could tell people just one thing, I wrote down everything I wish I could tell you, but if I could tell you one thing, it's that you are loved.
That's it. That's beautiful. And yes, if you're listening and you want to know what else she has to say, check out both of her books, especially Everything I Wish I Could Tell You About Midlife, because you're guiding us through this confusing season. And so thank you for that. And thank you for being on the Mercy Cast.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I think we could have talked all day.
Me too.